In the shadowed garden of Gossington Hall, where thorns whispered secrets to the wind, a scream shattered the twilight. A governess found lifeless amid crimson blooms, her hand clutching a single rose petal etched with a cryptic riddle. Welcome to Miss Marple's Rose Petal Riddle, a tale of petals that conceal poisons and puzzles that pierce the heart. Grab a cup of tea, sink into your coziest chair, and let the mystery unfold. If this story hooks you, hit subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Chapter 1. The Wilted Bloom. The village of St. Mary Mead had always been a place where secrets bloomed like wildflowers in untended hedges, their colours vivid, but their roots tangled in the soil of unspoken grudges. It was the sort of English hamlet where the postman knew your middle name before you did, and the vicar's sermons doubled as subtle warnings about the neighbour's wandering cat. On that fateful September evening in 1952, as the sun dipped low like a guilty conscience, the air hung heavy with the scent of late summer roses, those prickly beauties that Mrs. McGillicuddy so adored tending in her front garden. Little did anyone suspect that one of those roses would become the unlikely herald of murder, its petal a silent scroll bearing a riddle that would ensnare the sharpest minds in the village. Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming spinster with her silver hair pinned in a neat bun and her eyes like polished agates, always watching, always knitting, had just finished her afternoon tea in the parlour of her cottage on the green. The room was a sanctuary of faded chintz and lavender sachets, where the tick of the mantel clock marked time as reliably as the church bells. At 72, Miss Marple moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had long ago learned that haste was the enemy of clarity. She was folding a woolen shawl, her needles clicking softly, when the doorbell jangled like an alarm. It was young Constable Higgins, his uniform rumpled and his face flushed pinker than the hollyhocks outside. "Miss Marple, ma'am," he stammered, tipping his helmet awkwardly. "There's been... well, it's dreadful. Over at Gossington Hall. A body's been found in the rose garden. Mrs. Symington, the governess, you know? Stabbed, they think, but it's all a muddle. And there's this petal in her hand, with writing on it. The Colonel's in a right state, says it's some kind of game gone wrong." Miss Marple set down her knitting, her lips pursing in that familiar way that made grown men feel like schoolboys caught with sticky fingers in the jam pot. She didn't gasp or flutter. Oh no, that wasn't her style. Instead, she rose smoothly, smoothing her tweed skirt as if preparing for a garden party rather than a crime scene. "A petal, you say? With writing? How very peculiar. Lead on, Constable, and do tell me, was it one of the hybrid teas, or perhaps a rambler? The variety might matter, you see," as they hurried along the winding lane toward Gossington Hall, a sprawling Georgian pile with ivy-cloaked walls and a reputation for hosting more scandals than soirees. Higgins filled her in, with the breathless urgency of a man unaccustomed to real drama. The hall belonged to Colonel Arthur Bantry, Miss Marple's old friend and a retired military man whose bark was fiercer than his bite. His wife Dolly was the village's unofficial gossip curator, her parties legendary for the gin punches that loosened tongues and the croquet games that settled old scores. But this evening's gathering had started innocently enough, a harvest supper for the local gentry, with fairy lights strung through the arbours and trestle tables groaning under platters of cold chicken, potato salads flecked with chives, and Mrs. Bantry's famous Victoria sponge, its layers as fluffy as clouds over the downs. The guests had been a motley crew, the kind that made St. Mary Mead's social whirl spin like a teetotaler's head after one sherry too many. There was Dr. Haydock, the village physician, with his pipe perpetually clenched between teeth, yellowed by years of late-night house calls and stronger tobacco. Beside him sat his wife, Clara, a sharp-tongued botanist who specialised in rare orchids and rarer poisons, though she'd laugh off any suggestion of the latter with a wave of her gloved hand. Then came the Symingtons, Edward, the stern widower solicitor, whose ledgers balanced faster than his temper, and his second wife Elsie, the governess-turned-stepmother, a willowy woman in her 30s with auburn curls and a laugh like breaking glass. Their 2 boys, young Tommy and freckled Pip, had been shooed off to the nursery earlier, but not before Tommy had pocketed a fistful of sugar lumps from the tea tray. Rounding out the party were the Craddocks, Reverend Leonard, whose sermons on forgiveness rang hollow after his own youthful indiscretions, and his wife, Griselda, a vivacious blonde who organised the flower shows with the zeal of a general planning D-Day. And lurking in the corners, as always, was Mr. Polk, the village photographer, his camera slung around his neck like a noose, snapping candids that captured more than smiles. Frozen moments of envy, stolen glances, whispered barbs. The supper had hummed along merrily until Elsie Symington excused herself for a breath of air in the rose garden, citing a sudden headache from the heat. That was at 8:30. By 9, her scream echoed through the hall, cut short as abruptly as a snapped stem. Miss Marple arrived just as the last of the twilight bled away, the garden now lit by flickering lanterns that cast long shadows like accusing fingers. The rose beds were a riot of colour. Deep velvety crimsons from the Ena Harkness climbers, soft pinks from the Peace hybrids, and the occasional splash of white from Madame Alfred Carrière. But at the centre lay Elsie, sprawled on the flagstone path as if she'd merely dozed off among the petals, except for the blood, of course. It had soaked into her white silk blouse in a dark, ragged bloom, and her right hand was curled tight around something small and fragile. Constable Higgins had cordoned off the area with hastily strung police tape, but the guests milled about like bewildered bees, their murmurs a low buzz of speculation. Colonel Bantry, his moustache quivering like a divining rod over bad news, spotted Miss Marple and barrelled toward her, his +4s flapping. "Jane, thank heavens, this is a devilish business. Poor Elsie's gone. Knife in the ribs, they say. And look here." He thrust a tweed handkerchief into her palm, wrapped around the evidence. Unfolding it carefully, Miss Marple revealed the rose petal, a lush crimson specimen, its surface veined with faint ink strokes that formed words in a spidery hand. "Scatter me where the thorn pricks deepest, and roots of envy shall wither unseen." She read it aloud, her voice steady as a metronome, though her eyes narrowed behind her spectacles. "Poetry? Or some rot from a book?" The colonel blustered, mopping his brow with a handkerchief of his own. "The girl's no gardener. Why clutch that? And who writes riddles on petals? It's madness." Miss Marple slipped the petal back into its cloth shroud, her mind already turning like the pages of an old almanac. Riddles, she knew, were the village's hidden currency, playful at whist parties, venomous in anonymous notes slipped under doors. St. Mary Mead had its share of those, the poison pen letters that had plagued the parish 2 summers back, accusing housewives of everything from pilfered laundry to pilfered husbands. But this was bolder, bloodier. She knelt beside the body, discreetly, for the sheet draped over Elsie was thin as gossip, and noted the details that others missed. The wound was precise, a single thrust between the 3rd and 4th ribs, angled upward as if by someone shorter than the victim. No struggle marks on the wrists, no defensive scratches. Elsie's nails were manicured, painted a demure rose pink, unbroken, and there, caught in the hem of her skirt, a single thorn prick, barely a dot of blood, but enough to suggest she'd brushed against the bushes in the dark. Dr. Haydock approached, his stethoscope dangling like a medallion of defeat. "Jane, you shouldn't, though I suppose it's inevitable. Time of death around 8:45, I'd wager." Blade was sharp, likely a pruning knife from the garden shed. "No signs of robbery. Her pearl brooch is still pinned." He glanced at Clara, who hovered nearby, her face pale but composed, fiddling with a sprig of lavender from her pocket. "Clara found her first," screamed Blue Murder. "Says she heard footsteps rustling in the laurels just before." Clara Haydock stepped forward, her voice a cultivated lilt that masked the tremor beneath. I was fetching more ice from the summer house when I saw her silhouette against the lantern light. Then the thud, and she crumpled. I ran, but whoever it was melted into the shadows. The roses were thick there, easy to hide. Her eyes flicked to the petal in Miss Marple's hand. And that? Elsie was no poet. She barely read beyond the society pages. Miss Marple nodded, absorbing it all like a sponge in weak tea. She rose, brushing dew from her knees, and surveyed the guests. Edward Symington stood rigid by the French doors, his face a mask of granite, though his eyes darted like minnows in a stream toward the boy's window upstairs, perhaps, or the empty chair where his late first wife might have sat. The Craddocks clustered together, Griselda's hand on her husband's arm, whispering furiously. Mr. Pork fiddled with his flashbulb, angling for a shot of the chaos until the Colonel's glare sent him scuttling. And there, half hidden by the arbour, was Mrs. Price Ridley, the magistrate's wife, her lorgnette raised like a weapon as she catalogued every tear-stained cheek. As the local sergeant arrived with his notebook, a plodding fellow named Go Lightly, more at home with lost dogs than lost lives, Miss Marple drew the Colonel aside. "Arthur, we must tread softly. This petal isn't mere whimsy. It's a signature, a challenge. Scatter me where the thorn pricks deepest, that speaks of betrayal close to the heart, roots of envy buried deep." Who in this garden had cause to envy Elsie? A stepmother's role is thorny enough, but perhaps she pruned more than roses. The Colonel grunted, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook just a fraction. "Everyone's got thorns here, Jane. Symington's firm is drowning in debts." Elsie was pushing him to sell the old rectory plot. Haydock's clinic's under review. Rumours of botched prescriptions. And the Craddocks. Leonard's been dodging whispers about Griselda and that artist chap from London last month. Even Polk caught snapping Elsie's portrait unasked, blushing like a beet. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the rose bed, where petals littered the path like fallen soldiers' medals. She plucked a matching bloom, same crimson hue, same velvety texture, and held it to the light. The ink was India black, the sort used in fountain pens, not ballpoints. The handwriting slanted left, suggesting a southpaw. Practical tips for unravelling such knots, she mused inwardly, always began with the bloom itself. Examine the stem for sap stains on gloves. Check the soil for footprints mismatched to the party's shoes. But theories were ten a penny. Facts were the shears that cut through the overgrowth. Sergeant Golightly cleared his throat, flipping open his pad with a flourish. "Right then, ladies and gents. Statements, if you please. Starting with you, Mr. Symington. Where were you at 8:45? Edward straightened, his voice clipped as a barrister's objection. "Attending to the boys, Sergeant. Tommy had a nightmare about ghosts in the attic. Elsie usually soothed him, but I stepped in." "Alibi?" asked the nanny. "She was there," Griselda Craddock piped up, her tone bright as forced sunshine. "I saw Edward go upstairs around 8:30, Sergeant. I was in the pantry slicing lemons, lemonade for the children. But her eyes," Miss Marple noted, lingered too long on the garden gate, where a loose latch swung in the breeze. Dr. Haydock volunteered next, puffing his pipe. "Clara's my witness. I was regaling her with tales of that hybrid rose I grafted last spring, the one with the thorns like daggers. We stepped out for a smoke at 8:40. That's when she heard the scream." Clara nodded vigorously, but Miss Marple caught the subtle twist of her wedding ring. A botanist's tell, perhaps, when nerves frayed like old twine. "The footsteps," Clara added. "Light, hesitant, not a man's tread. Could have been a woman, or one of the lads sneaking sweets." The interviews dragged on under the stars, now pricking the sky like hesitant accusations. Mr. Pork claimed he'd been developing film in his darkroom tent behind the hall. Flashbulbs don't lie. Sergeant, while Mrs. Price Ridley swore she'd been indoors all evening, critiquing the sponge cake's sogginess. The boys, roused reluctantly, babbled about shadows and a lady with a secret box Elsie had hidden under her bed, trinkets from her governess days, perhaps, or something thornier. By midnight, as the guests dispersed into the chill, their carriages crunching gravel like brittle bones, Miss Marple lingered in the garden. She traced the Petal's riddle again, committing it to memory. Scatter me where the thorn pricks deepest, and roots of envy shall wither unseen. Scatter, like ashes or petals at a grave. The thorn's prick, a betrayal, intimate and sharp. Envy's roots, grudges fertilized by whispers, scandals sown in fertile village soil. She pocketed a sample petal, along with a sprig of lavender from Clara's path, scent for memory, evidence for truth. "Constable," she called softly to Higgins, who slumped against a pillar. "Fetch me a lantern and a trowel tomorrow dawn. We'll dig where the shadows fell deepest tonight." As she walked home under the moon's watchful eye, the village lamps flickering like wary sentinels, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill, the quiet certainty that this riddle, like all others, would unravel petal by petal, revealing not just a killer, but the wilted heart of St. Mary Mead itself. And so, as the clock strikes 1 and the roses sleep, we leave our sleuth to her dreams of thorns and truths. But dawn brings new blooms and deeper digs. Join me in Chapter 2, where the first petals scatter secrets that no garden can bury. Chapter 2. The Shadow in the Soil. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a chill that clung to the cobblestones like a guilty secret, the mist curling through the lanes as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Jane Marple stood in the rose garden of Gossington Hall, her sensible boots damp with dew, a borrowed lantern casting a buttery glow across the flagstones where Elsie Symington had fallen. The air was sharp with the scent of earth and bruised petals, and the crimson roses loomed like silent witnesses, their thorns glinting in the early light. Constable Higgins, yawning but dutiful, handed her a small trowel, his eyes bleary from a sleepless night. Miss Marple knelt beside the path, her tweed coat brushing the soil, and began to dig, not with the urgency of a hound, but with the patience of a gardener seeking roots. The sergeant's men had tramped through the garden at first light, their heavy boots leaving muddy smears, but they'd found nothing beyond a broken wineglass near the arbour and a cigarette stub, its tip stained with coral lipstick. Miss Marple, however, was not one for surface clues. She sifted the loose earth near the Ena Harkness climbers, where Clara Haydock had heard those fleeting footsteps. The soil was soft, recently turned, and her trowel soon struck something hard, a small tarnished locket, its silver chain tangled in the roots like a trapped snake. She eased it free, brushing away dirt to reveal an engraved initial, E. Elsie's perhaps, or another's lost in the haste of flight. Tucking the locket into her handkerchief, Miss Marple straightened and scanned the garden. The laurels Clara had mentioned stood thick to the east, their glossy leaves a perfect screen for a shadow to slip through. She paced the perimeter, noting a snapped twig here, a scuff in the mulch there, small signs, but to her, as telling as a shout. The garden gate, its latch still loose, creaked in the breeze, and beyond it lay the lane to the village, where early risers were already stirring, the baker's cart rattling, the milkman whistling off key. Someone had fled this way, she thought, light-footed and cautious, perhaps knowing the path by heart. Back at the hall, Colonel Bantry was pacing the breakfast room, his toast untouched as he muttered about the press sniffing around. Dolly Bantry, in a floral dressing gown, was pouring tea with a hand that trembled just enough to clink the china. "Jane, you're up with the larks," she said, her voice bright but strained. "The sergeant's got everyone in a tizzy. Says he'll call in Scotland Yard if we don't sort this by noon. Edward's taken the boys to his sister's in Chipping Cleghorn, poor lambs. And Clara's shut herself in her greenhouse, muttering about aphids." Miss Marple accepted a cup, her mind on the locket. "Dolly, did Elsie ever wear jewellery beyond that pearl brooch? A locket, perhaps, with a chain. Dolly frowned, stirring her tea absently. Not that I recall. She was all about simplicity. White blouses, sensible skirts. Though she had a way of making plain look pretty, didn't she? Edward gave her the brooch when they married last year. Caused a stir. Him remarrying so soon after poor Agnes. The mention of Agnes Symington, Edward's first wife, hung in the air like damp laundry. She died of pneumonia 2 winters back, leaving Edward a widower with 2 boys and a law practice teetering on ruin. Elsie, the governess who'd tamed Tommy's tantrums and taught Pip his letters, had stepped into the void, a promotion that raised eyebrows and sharpened tongues. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting Dolly's chatter flow. And Clara, she prompted gently. She knew Elsie well, being neighbours. Dolly leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Well enough to borrow sugar, but not much more. Clara's all plants and potions. Spends hours in that greenhouse of hers, mixing who knows what. She and Elsie had a row last month over some rare bulb Elsie stepped on by mistake. Clara called it botanical sacrilege, if you can believe it. But she was first to find the body, so perhaps she's just shaken. Leaving the Bantrys to their breakfast, Miss Marple ventured to the greenhouse, a glass dome tucked behind the hall's orchard. Clara Haydock was inside, her sleeves rolled up, pruning a cluster of orchids with surgical precision. Her face, framed by dark curls, was pale but composed, though her fingers twitched when Miss Marple knocked. "Jane," she said, forcing a smile, "come to admire my dendrobium. Or are you sleuthing?" "A bit of both," Miss Marple replied, her tone light as a breeze. She held up the locket, watching Clara's eyes. "Found this near the roses. Might it be yours?" Clara's smile faltered, her pruning shears pausing mid-snip. "No, not mine. Elsie's, perhaps. She was always fiddling with something. Nervous habit. You know." But her voice was too quick, like a bird startled from a branch. Miss Marple didn't press, instead admiring a tray of seedlings labelled Aconitum napellus. "Monkshood," she remarked. "Lovely, but deadly if mishandled, isn't it?" Clara nodded, her expression guarded. "Only if you're careless. I'm not. But Elsie, she was careless with more than plants." Stepping into Agnes's shoes, taking over the boys, it stirred bad blood. Tommy adored her, but Pip, he'd scowl when she tucked him in. The greenhouse door creaked open, revealing Mr. Polk, his camera dangling like a guilty conscience. "Mrs. Haydock, Oh, Miss Marple, didn't see you." He fumbled, his cheeks reddening. "Just thought I'd offer Clara some prints from last night for sentiment." Clara's lips tightened, but she took the envelope he thrust forward, her fingers brushing his. Miss Marple noted the exchange, Polk's nervous stammer, Clara's quick glance away. "Thank you, Mr. Polk," Clara said curtly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, these orchids won't prune themselves." Polk shuffled off, and Miss Marple followed the lane back to the village, the locket heavy in her pocket. At the post office, Mrs. Murgatroyd, the postmistress, was sorting letters with the zeal of a librarian guarding sacred texts. "Morning, Jane," she chirped, peering over her spectacles. "Heard about the fuss at the hall. Dreadful business. Elsie was in here yesterday, posting a letter to London. Thick envelope, express. Looked flustered, she did." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "London, you say? Did she mention who to?" Mrs. Murgatroyd shook her head, her curls bouncing. "Not a peep, but she paid extra for speed. Odd for her, always so frugal." The postmistress leaned closer, her voice a stage whisper. "And young Pip was with her, sulking something fierce. Muttered about secrets in boxes when he thought I wasn't listening." The day wore on, and Miss Marple visited the Symingtons' cottage, a neat stone affair with ivy framing the windows. The nanny, a stout woman named Mrs. Finch, was scrubbing dishes with vigour, her eyes red-rimmed. "The boys are with their aunt now," she said, wiping her hands. Poor Tommy's inconsolable. Elsie was his world. Pip, though, he's been odd since she came. Kept sneaking to her room, looking for that box of hers. Said it had bad things inside. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. A box, a locket, a letter to London, pieces of a puzzle, scattered like petals on the wind. She thanked Mrs. Finch and stepped into the cottage garden, where a single rosebush stood, its blooms a soft pink, unlike the crimson of Gossington Hall. A petal lay on the path, caught in a spider's web, and she bent to retrieve it. No writing, but its edge was torn, as if plucked in haste. By dusk, she was back at her cottage, the locket on her table beside a cooling teapot. She opened it carefully, revealing a tiny photograph inside, a woman's face, not Elsie's, but older, with sharp cheekbones and sad eyes. Agnes Symington, perhaps, or someone else tied to the Riddle's thorny heart. The village clock chimed 7, and Miss Marple jotted a note. Check Pork's photographs. Trace letters destination. Examine box. The soil of St. Mary Mead was yielding secrets, but the deepest roots remained buried. As the stars pricked the sky, we leave Miss Marple to her tea and her thoughts, the locket gleaming like a clue unclaimed. But shadows move faster than light, and in Chapter 3, a hidden box opens a door to motives as tangled as the roses themselves. Chapter 3. The Box Beneath the Bed. The morning sun slanted through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, painting delicate shadows on the parlour floor where her teacup sat, steam curling like a question mark. St. Mary Mead buzzed with whispers, the village shop and tea room alive with theories about Elsie Symington's death, each more fanciful than the last. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not swayed by gossip's fickle tide. She sat at her writing desk, the tarnished locket from the rose garden beside her notebook, its tiny photograph of a woman, not Elsie but perhaps Agnes, staring back with eyes that held their own secrets. Her mind turned to the nanny's words about a box, and young Pip's sullen mutterings about bad things hidden within. A box, she thought, was a small thing to hold such weight, but in a village like this, small things often carried the heaviest truths. She set out for the Symingtons' cottage, her straw hat shielding her from the autumn glare. The lane was quiet, save for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant bark of a dog. At the cottage, Mrs. Finch was hanging laundry, her broad hands pinning sheets with the precision of a soldier drilling. "Miss Marple," she greeted, her voice weary but warm. "Back so soon? The boys are still away, and Mr. Symington's at his office, burying himself in papers." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I wondered if I might have a look at Elsie's room, Mrs. Finch. A small matter, something about her belongings." Mrs. Finch hesitated, then nodded, leading her inside. The cottage was tidy, but heavy with absence, its air thick with the scent of beeswax and grief. Elsie's room, at the end of a narrow hall, was sparse. A single bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser topped with a chipped mirror, and a wardrobe of modest dresses. Miss Marple knelt by the bed, her fingers brushing the floorboards until they found a loose one, just as Pip's words had hinted. Beneath it was a wooden box, no bigger than a biscuit tin, its lid carved with a rose motif. She lifted it carefully, noting the lack of dust, a sign it had been handled recently. Inside were papers, tightly folded, and a small key, its brass dulled by time. The papers were letters, not in Elsie's looping hand, but in a sharper, more angular script. Miss Marple unfolded the topmost one, dated a month ago. It read, "You think you've won, stepping into her place, but the past doesn't sleep. Leave the boys be, or thorns will find you." No signature, just a smudge of ink, black as the kind on the rose petal. She tucked the letters into her bag, the key in her pocket, and replaced the box, her heart ticking like her mantel clock. Poison pen letters again, she thought. But these were no village prank. They cut too close to the bone. At the village post office, Mrs. Murgatroyd was sorting parcels, her spectacles sliding down her nose. "Jane, you're everywhere today," she said, chuckling. More questions about Elsie's letter. Miss Marple leaned on the counter, her tone mild. Indeed, that express letter to London. Any chance you recall the address? Mrs. Murgatroyd tapped her chin, then rifled through a ledger. Here it is, a Mr. Reginald Blake, care of a solicitor's firm in Bloomsbury. Odd, though, Elsie never mentioned London folk, always kept to herself, except for those boys. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped into the street, where Mr. Polk was adjusting his camera tripod outside the butcher's. His face lit up, then dimmed under her steady gaze. Miss Marple, I've those prints from the supper, if you're curious. He handed her a stack, his fingers fidgety. The photographs captured the harvest supper in vivid monochrome. Dolly Bantry laughing over her gin punch, Edward Symington glowering at his plate, Clara Haydock adjusting her gloves near the roses. One image caught Miss Marple's eye. Elsie, alone by the arbour, her face tense, glancing over her shoulder as if sensing a shadow. In the background, a figure blurred by motion, too vague to identify, but wearing a light-coloured coat. Mr. Polk, she said, holding up the photo. This figure, did you see who it was? He squinted, scratching his neck. Can't say I did. Too busy with the lens. Could have been anyone. Guests were milling about like ants. His voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow despite the cool air. She thanked him and moved on, the photograph joining the letters in her bag. By noon, she was at the vicarage, where Griselda Craddock was arranging chrysanthemums for Sunday's service. Her blonde curls bounced as she turned, her smile bright but brittle. Jane, you're a regular sleuth these days. Leonard's at a parish meeting, but I'm happy to chat. Miss Marple settled into a chintz armchair, her eyes on Griselda's hands, which trembled slightly as she snipped stems. Griselda, you mentioned slicing lemons during the supper. Did you see Elsie leave for the garden? Griselda's scissors paused. Oh yes, she slipped out quietly, said she needed air. I thought nothing of it. The room was stuffy, but I stayed in the pantry until Clara's scream. Her eyes flicked to the window, where the church spire pierced the sky. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the light-coloured coat in Polk's photograph. Griselda's shawl, draped over a chair, was pale blue, close enough to match. The afternoon found Miss Marple at Dr. Haydock's clinic, a squat building smelling of antiseptic and pipe smoke. The doctor was scribbling notes, his pipe unlit between his teeth. Jane, you're tireless, he said, chuckling. What now? Another clue? She produced the key from Elsie's box, holding it up. Ever seen this, Doctor? Perhaps it fits something in Elsie's life? Haydock frowned, turning it over. Not familiar, but Elsie was private. She came in last week, complaining of nerves. Prescribed her a mild tonic. Mentioned a family heirloom, though. Something she kept locked away. Could this be it? Miss Marple's thoughts raced. A locked heirloom. A locket with a stranger's face. Letters dripping with venom. Was Elsie guarding a secret? Or was she its victim? She left the clinic, pausing by the churchyard, where gravestones leaned like weary sentinels. Agnes Symington's stone was modest, its inscription faded. Beloved wife and mother taken too soon. A fresh rose lay at its base, pink as the one in Elsie's garden, its petals untouched by ink, but heavy with dew. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the letters spread before her. Each one sharpened the riddle's edge. Warnings to Elsie about stealing the boys, hints of a debt unpaid, a past unburied. The key gleamed in the lamplight, promising answers, if she could find its lock. The village clock struck 9, and she penned a note to herself. Trace Reginald Blake. Check Griselda's movements. Examine Polk's darkroom. St. Mary Mead's secrets were piling up like autumn leaves, but the truth was a stubborn root, waiting to be unearthed. As the night deepens and the roses fade, we leave Miss Marple to her notes and her tea, the key a silent challenge on her table. In Chapter 4, a London letter reveals a name that twists the thorns tighter, pulling our sleuth deeper into the riddle's heart. Chapter 4. The London Letter. The autumn wind rattled the windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, stirring the lace curtains as if urging the secrets of St. Mary Mead to spill into the open. By mid-morning, the village was a hum of activity, milk bottles clinking on doorsteps, the blacksmith's hammer ringing like a metronome. But Miss Marple's parlour remained a quiet haven, where the brass key from Elsie's box glinted beside her teapot. The poison pen letters, with their sharp words and sharper threats, lay neatly stacked, each one a thorn in her thoughts. Her mind lingered on the express letter Elsie had sent to London, to a Mr. Reginald Blake in Bloomsbury. A solicitor's firm, Mrs. Murgatroyd had said, and Miss Marple knew that such threads, when tugged, often unravelled the tightest knots. She donned her coat and hat, her steps brisk as she made for the village telephone exchange, a cramped booth smelling of polished wood and overheated wires. The operator, Miss Clara Bunce, was a wiry woman with a knack for remembering every call made in St. Mary Mead. "Miss Marple," she greeted, adjusting her headset. "Here to solve our murder, I presume." Her tone was teasing, but her eyes were sharp with curiosity. Miss Marple smiled, unfurling her charm like a well-worn shawl. "Just a small inquiry, Clara. Might you check if Elsie Symington placed any calls to London recently? Perhaps to a solicitor named Blake?" Miss Bunce flipped through her logbook, her finger tracing inky rows. "Here we are. 2 calls last month to a London number, Bloomsbury Exchange. One on the 10th, another on the 20th. Both short, under a minute." Elsie sounded rushed, kept her voice low. Miss Marple nodded, her mind slotting the detail into place like a puzzle piece. Short calls meant caution, perhaps fear of being overheard. She thanked Miss Bunce and headed to the train station, where the 11:15 to London puffed steam like a dragon rousing from sleep. The journey to Bloomsbury was a blur of green fields and sooty tunnels, the train's rhythm lulling her thoughts to the riddle. Scatter me where the thorn pricks deepest. In London, the solicitor's office was a narrow building wedged between a bookshop and a tea room, its brass plaque reading Blake & Sons, solicitors. Mr. Reginald Blake was a gaunt man in his 50s, his suit as grey as the fog outside. He ushered Miss Marple into a cluttered office where files teetered like unstable cliffs. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, peering over his spectacles. "From St. Mary Mead. I heard about Mrs. Symington's tragedy. How may I assist?" She produced the express letter's details, her voice gentle but firm. "Elsie sent you something, Mr. Blake. A thick envelope posted the day before her death. Might you share its contents?" Blake hesitated, his fingers drumming the desk, then retrieved a file from a locked drawer. "Mrs. Symington was discreet. She sent me a will drawn up last month. Wanted it notarized urgently. It named her stepsons, Tommy and Pip, as beneficiaries of a small trust. Funds from her late father, a merchant in Bristol. Nothing grand, but enough to ruffle feathers." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Feathers, Mr. Blake? Whose?" He leaned back, choosing his words like steps on thin ice. Her husband Edward wasn't named in the will, nor was he pleased when she told him, judging by her letter. Said he felt bypassed, as if she didn't trust him with the boy's future. There was also a note about a locket. She asked me to verify its provenance. Said it belonged to Agnes Symington, but she suspected it held something compromising. The locket, again. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the handkerchief in her pocket, where the silver piece rested. "And did you verify it?" Blake shook his head. "Not yet. She was to send it, but then, well, the news came." He handed her a copy of the will, its pages crisp with legal jargon, and a sealed envelope addressed to Elsie, unposted. "This arrived from a colleague in Bristol yesterday. It's about the locket's history. You may find it useful." Back in St. Mary Mead by dusk, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the envelope open before her. Inside was a jeweller's report. The locket, crafted in 1930, had been commissioned by Agnes Symington's father, a gift for her engagement to Edward. Its clasp held a hidden compartment, empty now, but designed for a miniature document. perhaps a love note, or something less innocent. The report noted a jeweller's mark matching a Bristol shop known for discreet commissions, often for families with secrets to keep. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. It was Dolly Bantry, her face flushed from a brisk walk. "Jane, you'll never guess Griselda's been acting odd. I saw her at the churchyard laying flowers on Agnes's grave, pink roses, just like the ones in Elsie's garden. And she was crying Jane proper tears. Said something about making things right. Odd, don't you think?" Miss Marple's needles, idle in her lap, seemed to twitch. Griselda, with her pale blue shawl, weeping over a rival's grave. Grief or guilt. She visited the churchyard herself, the air thick with the scent of yew and damp earth. Agnes's grave was indeed adorned with pink roses, their stems freshly cut. Nearby, a footprint in the mud, small, narrow like a woman's shoe. Miss Marple crouched, her eyes tracing the tread to the lane, where it vanished in the gravel. Griselda's tears, the roses, the footprint, threads weaving a pattern, but not yet a tapestry. At the vicarage, Reverend Leonard Craddock was polishing candlesticks, his face drawn. "Griselda's resting," he said before Miss Marple could ask. "She's been out of sorts since the supper. Elsie's death hit her hard. They were schoolmates once, you know, before Elsie went governessing." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. Schoolmates meant shared history, perhaps shared secrets. "And you, Leonard? Where were you when Elsie screamed?" He flushed, his cloth pausing. "In the library, reading psalms. Griselda can vouch for me. She brought me tea just before." The evening drew Miss Marple to Mr. Polk's darkroom, a shed behind his cottage, its windows blacked out with cloth. He was rinsing prints, his hands stained with chemicals. "Miss Marple," he stammered, nearly dropping a tray. "More photos?" She smiled, holding up the supper image with the blurred figure. "This coat, light-coloured, perhaps blue. Did you notice anyone wearing such a thing?" Polk swallowed, his eyes darting. Could have been Griselda's shawl, or Clara's jacket. She had a pale one. It was dark, hard to tell. His voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw his hands tremble, not just from the cold. Back home, she lit a lamp and studied the will, the jeweller's report, the poison pen letters. The locket's compartment nagged at her. What had it held? A note tying Elsie to Agnes's past, a clue to Edward's debts. The key from Elsie's box sat heavy in her palm, its lock still a mystery. She jotted a note. "Visit jeweller in Bristol. Check Griselda's shawl. Trace Park's nerves." The village was a garden of motives, each player a bloom with thorns unseen. As the clock chimes 10 and the night folds over St. Mary Mead, we leave Miss Marple with her papers and her puzzles, the locket's secret whispering like a breeze through roses. In Chapter 5, a Bristol jeweller's tale twists the riddle, and a hidden lock opens a door to betrayal. Chapter 5. The Jeweller's Secret. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, draping the village in a veil as soft as the secrets it guarded. Miss Jane Marple stood at the station platform, her gloved hands clutching a small valise, the brass key from Elsie's box nestled safely in her pocket beside the locket and the jeweller's report. The train to Bristol was due any minute, its distant whistle cutting through the quiet like a knife through silk. Her mind was a tangle of threads. Griselda's tears at Agnes's grave, Polk's trembling hands, the will that bypassed Edward Symington, but the locket's hidden compartment was the knot she needed to unravel. Bristol, with its old jeweller's shop, promised answers, and Miss Marple was not one to let a promise go untested. The journey was a rattle of wheels and fleeting glimpses of hedgerows, the countryside blurring past like a half-remembered dream. In Bristol, she found the jeweller's shop on a cobbled street, its sign faded but proud, Harrington and Sons, Est, 1890. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses looked up from a velvet tray of brooches. Mr. Harrington, his hands gnarled as oak roots, listened as Miss Marple explained her errand. producing the locket with its engraved E in empty compartment. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion but recognition, as he turned it over in the lamplight. "This," he said, his voice gravelly, "was one of my father's commissions, made for Agnes Fairchild, Symington, later, before her marriage to Edward. A special request, that locket. The compartment was for a miniature will, her father's idea. He was a merchant, cautious sort, wanted her protected if the marriage soured." Miss Marple leaned forward, her scarf slipping slightly. "And did it hold such a document?" Harrington shook his head. "Not when it left here. Agnes collected it herself, radiant as a bride should be. But years later, she came back. 1935, maybe 36, asked me to clean it. There was a paper inside then, folded tight. I didn't read it, mind, but she looked haunted." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her valise. "A miniature will, or perhaps a confession?" She pressed gently. "Did Elsie Symington ever visit Mr. Harrington, or mention the locket?" The jeweller rubbed his chin, memory creasing his brow. "Once, last summer, she came asking about Agnes's jewellery. Said she'd found the locket in Edward's study after Agnes passed. Wanted to know if it was valuable. I told her it was sentimental, not costly, but she seemed anxious, kept glancing at the door, like she expected someone to follow." Thanking him, Miss Marple stepped into the Bristol drizzle, her mind turning like a spindle. Agnes's locket, Elsie's fear, a compartment meant for secrets. Had Elsie found something that pricked too deep? Back in St. Mary Mead by afternoon, she stopped at the village hall, where Dolly Bantry was organising a charity bazaar, her arms full of knitted scarves. "Jane, you look like you've seen a ghost," Dolly exclaimed, setting down her bundle. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not a ghost, Dolly, but a shadow. Tell me, did Agnes ever speak of her family's wealth, or a will apart from Edward's?" Dolly's brow furrowed as she poured tea from a thermos. Agnes was private, but there was talk her father left her a nest egg separate from Edward's grasp. He was cross about it, I heard. Said it was unwifely to keep secrets. When Elsie married him, some thought she was after that money, but she doted on those boys, not gold. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting Dolly's mention of Edward's temper. A man bypassed by two wives' wills might nurture thorns of his own. Her next stop was the Symingtons' cottage, where Mrs. Finch was sweeping the porch, her face etched with worry. "The boys are back tomorrow," she said, leaning on her broom. "Mr. Symington's been at his office all day, burning papers from the smoke I saw." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Burning papers? Curious. Might I see Elsie's garden again, Mrs. Finch?" The nanny nodded, leading her to the small plot where the pink rosebush stood, its blooms now drooping in the damp. Miss Marple knelt, examining the soil. A glint caught her eye. A tiny brass fragment, half buried, shaped like the tooth of a lock. She pocketed it, her heart quickening. The key's mate, perhaps? At the village shop, she found Mr. Polk buying tobacco, his camera absent for once. "Miss Marple," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. "Heard you were in Bristol." News travelled fast, she noted, her smile disarming. "Indeed, Mr. Polk. Your photographs have been most helpful. Did you ever snap Agnes Symington by chance?" He shifted, his fingers fumbling with coins. "A few times at church fetes. She was shy, didn't like the lens. Elsie, though, she posed willingly, always smiling for the boys." His voice caught, and Miss Marple saw a flush creep up his neck. A man smitten or a man hiding more? By evening, she was back in her parlour, the locket open before her. The brass fragment fit the key's size, suggesting a lock nearby, perhaps in Edward's study or the boy's nursery. She unfolded the poison pen letters again, their venom sharper in the lamplight. "Leave the boys, or pay the price." Had Elsie's will, favouring Tommy and Pip, stirred this spite, or was the locket's lost paper the true thorn? She wrote a note. "Search Edward's study. Check Park's old prints. Ask boys about locket." The village was a maze of motives, each path lined with roses and lies. As the clock struck 8 and the fire crackled low, Miss Marple sipped her tea, the locket gleaming like a challenge unanswered. St. Mary Mead's secrets were blooming, but the deepest prick was yet to come. In Chapter 6, a locked drawer in Edward's study yields a clue that twists the riddle's roots, and a child's memory cuts through the thorns. Chapter 6. The Locked Drawer. The late September sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, gilding the rooftops as if to soften the village's sharp edges. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, the brass key and its matching fragment from Elsie's garden glinting on her table, a silent dare to find their lock. The poison pen letters, the locket's empty compartment, and the will favouring Tommy and Pip swirled in her mind like leaves in a gust. Edward Symington's study, with its rumoured smoke of burning papers, beckoned as the next knot to untie. She tucked the key into her pocket, her shawl snug against the morning chill, and set out for the Symingtons' cottage, where the air felt heavy with more than autumn damp. Mrs. Finch was at the gate, her apron dusted with flour from baking. "Miss Marple, the boys are back," she said, her voice low. Tommy's quiet as a mouse, but Pip's been poking about Elsie's room again. Mr. Symington's in his study. "Hasn't come out since breakfast." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes catching a flicker of movement at an upstairs window. Pip's freckled face, peering down, then gone. "Might I speak with the boys, Mrs. Finch? And perhaps see Mr. Symington's study, if he'll allow." Inside, the cottage was hushed, the ticking of a clock the only sound. Tommy sat in the parlour, clutching a wooden soldier, his eyes red but dry. Pip slouched beside him, his scowl as sharp as the thorns in the garden. "Hello, boys," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a lullaby. "Pip, you mentioned Elsie's box to Mrs. Finch. Did she ever show you a key? Or perhaps a locket?" Pip's gaze darted to the floor, his fingers twisting a loose thread on his jumper. "She hid things," he muttered. "Said they were for us, not father. A locket once. She showed me a picture inside, but it wasn't her. I didn't like it. Made her sad," Tommy piped up, his voice small. "Elsie said the locket was magic, like a fairy tale, but Pip said it was bad luck." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Pip's unease, Tommy's trust. She knelt, her knees creaking. Did Elsie ever mention a drawer or a lock she kept special? Pip shrugged, but his eyes flicked toward the study door. "She went in there sometimes when father was out. Said she was tidying." Mrs. Finch led Miss Marple to the study, a dim room lined with books and ledgers, the air thick with pipe smoke. Edward Symington sat at his desk, his face haggard, papers strewn like fallen petals. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone clipped but weary, "I suppose you're here about Elsie. The sergeant's been no help. Says it's a vagrant, but I don't believe it." She smiled gently, her eyes on the desk's single drawer, its brass lock gleaming. "Might I look around, Edward? Small details can be illuminating." He nodded, distracted by a letter in his hand, and Miss Marple approached the desk. The key from Elsie's box fit the lock with a soft click, the drawer sliding open to reveal a bundle of envelopes, their edges charred as if kissed by flame. She lifted them carefully, more poison pen letters but older, addressed to Agnes in the same angular script. "You can't hide forever. The boys deserve better." Her breath caught. The hand matched the notes to Elsie, linking past to present. Beneath the letters was a photograph, creased and faded. Agnes and Edward on their wedding day, her smile tight, his hand gripping hers like a vice. Edward noticed her scrutiny and stood, his chair scraping. "Those are private, Jane. Old letters, nothing more." His voice was sharp, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Miss Marple closed the drawer, the key still in her hand. "Of course, Edward, but secrets like roses don't stay buried long." She excused herself, the charred letters burning in her memory as she stepped into the garden, where Pip was kicking stones by the rose bush. "Pip," she said, crouching to his level, "did Elsie ever talk about your mother's things? A locket or papers?" He scuffed his shoe, his voice barely a whisper. "She found something in father's desk once. Said it was mother's secret, not hers to tell. "She was scared, miss. Said someone was watching her." His eyes darted to the cottage, where Edward's shadow loomed at the window. Miss Marple's next stop was the village hall, where Mr. Polk was setting up for a photography exhibit, his prints pinned to boards like butterflies. She found one of Agnes, taken at a fete years ago, her locket glinting at her throat. "Mr. Polk," she said, her tone light, "you've a keen eye. Did Elsie ever ask you about Agnes's photographs?" He fumbled a pin, his face paling. "She did last spring. Wanted copies of Agnes's pictures, said it was for the boys. I gave her a few, but she kept asking about private ones I didn't show." Her needles seemed to click in her mind. Private photographs, a locket's hidden paper, charred letters, each a petal in the Riddle's bloom. She thanked Polk and walked to the churchyard, where the pink roses on Agnes's grave were wilting, their scent faint. A glint in the grass caught her eye. A hairpin, its curve matching Clara Haydock's style, though many women use such things. She pocketed it, her thoughts on Clara's greenhouse, where poisons grew as easily as orchids. By dusk, Miss Marple was back at her cottage, the key and its fragment on her table, the charred letters beside them. She wrote a note. "Check Clara's hairpins. Search Polk's private prints. Ask Edward about Agnes's will." The village was a web of glances and grudges, each thread pulling her closer to the thorn that pricked deepest. As the stars wink over St. Mary Mead, and the night hums with secrets, we leave Miss Marple with her clues, the drawer's contents a whisper of betrayal. In Chapter 7, a hidden photograph reveals a face that shifts the riddle, and a greenhouse secret cuts closer to the truth. Chapter 7. The Hidden Photograph. The dusk settled over St. Mary Mead like a velvet cloak, softening the village's edges, but not its secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, the glow of a single lamp illuminating the charred letters from Edward's study and the hairpin from the churchyard, its curve a silent accusation, the locket's empty compartment, and Pip's whispered fears about Elsie's discoveries gnawed at her. But Mr. Polk's mention of private photographs tugged hardest at her thoughts. A photograph could capture more than a moment. It could freeze a truth too dangerous to speak. With her shawl draped over her shoulders, she set out for Polk's cottage, the night air sharp with the promise of frost. Polk's shed. Tucked behind his cottage was a cave of shadows, its air thick with the tang of developing chemicals. He was pinning up prints when Miss Marple knocked, his hands jerking as if caught stealing tarts. "Miss Marple, you're out late," he stammered, his eyes darting to a locked tin box on a shelf. She smiled, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I was hoping to see those private photographs you mentioned, Mr. Polk. The ones Elsie asked for, about Agnes, perhaps." His face flushed, and he fumbled with his keys, muttering about mislaid negatives. After a moment's hesitation, he unlocked the tin and handed her a small stack of prints, his fingers trembling. These were personal. Agnes didn't want them shown, but Elsie insisted, said it was for the boys' memories. Miss Marple sifted through the images. Agnes at a picnic, her smile strained. Agnes with baby Tommy, her eyes distant. And then, one that stopped her breath, a candid of Agnes in the rose garden at Gossington Hall, her locket open, a tiny paper visible inside. Beside her stood Clara Haydock, her face turned away, but her hand resting on Agnes's arm, an intimacy that spoke of more than neighbourly chats. "This," Miss Marple said, holding up the photograph. "When was it taken?" Polk swallowed, his voice low. "Summer of '49, before Agnes fell ill. She and Clara were thick as thieves then, always in the greenhouse or the garden. Elsie saw this one and got upset. Wouldn't say why." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Clara's hand, the hairpin in her pocket suddenly heavier. She thanked Polk, who looked relieved to see her go, and slipped the photograph into her bag, its edges sharp as a blade. Her next stop was Clara Haydock's greenhouse, where the glass panes glowed faintly under the moon. Clara was inside, tending a tray of monkshood, her movements precise but her face pale as the petals. "Jane," she said, startled, setting down her trowel. "You're like a cat, creeping in so quietly." Miss Marple held up the hairpin, its curve catching the light. "I found this by Agnes's grave, Clara. Yours, perhaps." Clara's smile faltered, her fingers brushing her hair where similar pins held her curls. "Could be anyone's," she said too quickly. "Half the village wears them." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the monk's hood. "You and Agnes were close, I hear. Did she ever share her troubles about Edward or a locket?" Clara's eyes flickered, but her voice was steady. "Agnes was private. We talked plants, not secrets. She loved roses like Elsie, but she was fragile. Edward's temper wore her down." She paused, snipping a dead leaf. Elsie stirred things up, taking her place. Some didn't take kindly to that. The conversation lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she walked home, the photograph a weight in her bag. At her cottage, she spread it beside the locket and the charred letters, noting the paper in Agnes's locket. Too small to read, but its presence a clue. Had Elsie found it, and with it a truth that cost her life? She visited the vicarage next morning, where Griselda Craddock was polishing silver, her hands restless. "Jane, you're tireless," Griselda said, her smile tight. "Still chasing ghosts?" Miss Marple produced the photograph, watching Griselda's face. "Clara and Agnes so close. Did you ever join them in the garden?" Griselda's polished cloth paused, her eyes on Clara's hand in the image. "Sometimes," she said, her voice clipped. "Agnes was sweet, but Clara, she was possessive. Didn't like Elsie nosing around after Agnes died. Said Elsie was digging where she shouldn't." Miss Marple's needles seemed to click in her thoughts. Clara's greenhouse, her pins, her history with Agnes. She thanked Griselda and stepped into the churchyard, where a fresh pink rose lay on Agnes's grave, its petals damp with dew. By afternoon, she was at the Bantry's for tea, Colonel Bantry grumbling about the sergeant's lack of progress. "Jane, they're saying it's a crime of passion now," he said, slicing a scone. "But who'd passion over Elsie, eh? She was all duty, no fire," Dolly chimed in, her eyes bright. "Oh, Arthur, don't be dense. Elsie had admirers, Polk for one, always snapping her picture. And Clara wasn't fond of her, not after that bulb business." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind on the photograph's intimacy, Clara's guarded words. Back home, she lit a lamp and studied the evidence. The locket, its compartment empty, the photograph with Clara's touch on Agnes, the letters linking Agnes's pain to Elsie's fate. She wrote a note, question Clara about Agnes's locket, check Park's negatives for more candids, trace Monkshood's use. The village was a tapestry of loyalties and lies, each stitch pulling her closer to the Riddle's heart. As the clock strikes 9 and the night wraps St. Mary Mead in silence, we leave Miss Marple with her clues, the photograph a window to a buried bond. In Chapter 8, a greenhouse discovery twists the thorn deeper, and a forgotten letter names a shadow in the roses. Chapter 8. The greenhouse shadow. The morning light crept into St. Mary Mead, soft as a whisper, but the village's secrets cast shadows far sharper than the sun. Miss Jane Marple stood in her parlour, the photograph of Agnes and Clara in the rose garden lying beside the locket and the charred letters, its image of Clara's hand on Agnes's arm burning in her memory, the hairpin from the churchyard, the monkshood in Clara's greenhouse, and Pip's words about Elsie's fear of being watched, wove a thread that pointed to Clara Haydock's glass-domed sanctuary. With her shawl pinned tight against the autumn chill, Miss Marple set out for the greenhouse, her steps measured but her mind racing like a loom threading a pattern. The greenhouse stood behind Gossington Hall, its panes misted with dew, the air inside heavy with earth and the sharp tang of sap. Clara was there, tending a tray of foxgloves, her gloves stained green, her face a mask of calm that cracked slightly when she saw Miss Marple. "Jane, you're persistent," she said, her voice light but her eyes wary. "Come to admire my plants again." Miss Marple smiled, her gaze drifting to a shelf where a small vial of dark liquid sat, unlabeled, beside a mortar and pestle. Your monkshood intrigued me, Clara. Such potent plants, useful for study, but dangerous in the wrong hands. Clara's fingers tightened on her trowel, but she laughed, a sound like glass breaking. I'm careful, Jane. My work's all science, not mischief. Miss Marple nodded, stepping closer to the shelf where a notebook lay open, its pages filled with botanical sketches and notes on alkaloids. One entry caught her eye: aconitum extract, lethal in small doses, mimics heart failure. She pointed to it, her tone mild. Did Elsie ever ask about your remedies, Clara? She was nervous, Dr. Haydock said. Clara's smile faded, her hand brushing a hairpin loose from her curls, one matching the churchyard find. Elsie was curious, she admitted. Came here once, asking about poisons for a story she was writing for the boys. I humoured her, but she was intrusive. Miss Marple's eyes followed the hairpin as it fell, noting Clara's quick move to retrieve it. She changed tack, producing the photograph of Agnes and Clara. You and Agnes were close, this shows. Did Elsie's question stir old memories? Clara's face paled, her fingers crushing a foxglove leaf. Agnes was my friend, she said, her voice low. Elsie had no right digging into her life, asking about lockets and letters. She was stirring up trouble, Jane, for Edward, for the boys. Her words hung heavy, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of something, grief or guilt, in her eyes. Leaving the greenhouse, Miss Marple walked to the village post office, where Mrs. Murgatroyd was sorting mail with her usual zeal. Jane, you're a regular sleuth, she said, peering over her spectacles. Any more on Elsie's London letter? Miss Marple leaned in, her voice soft. Not that. But have you seen any letters from Clara Haydock recently? Perhaps to Bristol? Mrs. Murgatroyd frowned, flipping through her ledger. One, last week, to a chemist in Bristol, about plant extracts. She's always ordering odd things for that greenhouse of hers. The chemist's letter nagged at Miss Marple as she headed to Mr. Polk's shed, where he was sorting negatives. His hands steadier than before, but his eyes still nervous. Miss Marple, he greeted, wiping his brow. More photos. She held up the Agnes and Clara print, her tone gentle. This was illuminating, Mr. Polk. Did you keep any others from that day, perhaps showing Elsie nearby? He hesitated, then pulled a negative from a box, holding it to the light. The image was faint, but it showed Elsie in the background, her face tense, watching Clara and Agnes from the rose garden's edge. She was always there, Polk muttered. Watching, asking questions, made Clara cross. Miss Marple thanked him and returned to the Symingtons' cottage, where Mrs. Finch was peeling potatoes, her face drawn. The boys are at school, she said. But Pip's been drawing pictures, roses, always roses, with thorns like knives. Miss Marple asked to see Pip's drawings, and Mrs. Finch fetched a sketchbook from the nursery. The pages were filled with childish scrawls, but one stood out, a rose with a locket tangled in its thorns, and a figure in a light coat, faceless but looming. He drew this after Elsie died, Mrs. Finch said. Said it was what he saw in his dreams. By evening, Miss Marple was back in her parlour, the notebook, the photograph, and Pip's drawing spread before her. The vial in Clara's greenhouse, the chemist's letter, Elsie spying in the garden. Each piece sharpened the riddle's edge. She wrote a note. Verify Clara's chemist order. Check Pip's dreams with Tommy. Search greenhouse for extracts. The village was a thicket of motives, and Clara's shadow loomed larger, her hands stained with more than soil. As the clock chimes 10 and the night seals St. Mary Mead in quiet, we leave Miss Marple with her evidence, the greenhouse's secrets blooming like poison in the dark. In Chapter 9, a child's tale and a chemist's reply twist the thorn deeper, and the riddle's heart beats closer to the truth. Chapter 9. The Child's Tale. The morning fog wrapped St. Mary Mead in a hush as if the village itself were listening for the next clue to Elsie Symington's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, the lamplight casting soft glows on Pip's drawing of a rose-entwined locket and a shadowy figure in a light coat, the vial of dark liquid in Clara Haydock's greenhouse, the chemist's letter Mrs. Murgatroyd mentioned, and the photograph of Clara and Agnes lingered in her mind like thorns caught in wool. But it was Pip's dreams, his childish sketches heavy with fear, that pulled her toward the Symingtons' cottage once more. A child's eyes, she knew, often saw what adults missed, and Pip's tale might hold the key to the Riddle's heart. At the cottage, Mrs. Finch was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour, her eyes weary. "Miss Marple, you're back," she said, wiping her brow. "The boys are in the garden playing, though Pip's been quiet since his drawings." Miss Marple found the boys by the pink rosebush, Tommy tossing a ball while Pip sat cross-legged, sketching in the dirt with a stick. She knelt beside him, her voice soft as a breeze. "Pip, your drawing was very striking. The figure in the coat. Did you see it that night, or only in your dreams?" Pip's stick paused, his freckles stark against his pale face. "Saw it," he whispered, "by the roses when Elsie screamed. It moved fast, like a ghost, but it had her hairpin. Like Mrs. Haydock's." Miss Marple's heart quickened, the hairpin from the churchyard heavy in her pocket. "And the locket, Pip? Did Elsie show it to you that day?" He nodded, his eyes on the dirt. "She said it was mother's, but it made her sad. Said someone wanted it back, someone angry. I heard her tell father she'd send it away, to keep it safe." Tommy, listening nearby, dropped his ball. "Elsie was nice," he said, his voice small. "But Pip said she found bad things in father's desk. Letters, like the ones that made mother cry." Leaving the boys, Miss Marple returned to the village post office, where Mrs. Murgatroyd was bundling letters. "Jane, you're tireless," she said, chuckling. "Back for Clara's chemist letter?" Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle. "Did it arrive by chance?" Mrs. Murgatroyd rummaged through a tray, producing a thin envelope from Bristol. "Came this morning. Returned to sender. Address was wrong. It's unopened, but you can take a peek." Miss Marple slit the envelope carefully, revealing a chemist's invoice for aconite extract, ordered by Clara Haydock 2 weeks before Elsie's death. A note scrawled in the margin read, "For research only. Handle with care." Her needles seemed to click in her mind. Aconite, the monkshood's poison, could mimic a heart attack, but Elsie's wound was a blade's work. A decoy, perhaps? She headed to Gossington Hall, where Dolly Bantry was sorting linens, her chatter bright but strained. "Jane, the sergeant's in a flap. Says he's calling Scotland Yard tomorrow if no one confesses. Clara's been odd, shut in her greenhouse all day." Miss Marple sipped the offered tea, her eyes on the rose garden visible through the window. "Dolly, did Clara ever mention aconite to you? For her plants, perhaps?" Dolly frowned, folding a napkin. "Not directly, but she's always brewing something in there. Last month she gave Elsie a tonic for nerves, said it was herbal, nothing strong. Elsie drank it, though she made a face." The greenhouse was Miss Marple's next stop, its glass walls steaming in the midday sun. Clara was absent, but the door was unlocked, and Miss Marple stepped inside, the air thick with earth and bitter herbs. The vial of dark liquid was gone from the shelf, but a journal lay open, its pages detailing experiments with aconite. Diluted for pest control, undiluted fatal in minutes. A loose page fluttered to the floor, written in Clara's neat hand. "She knows too much. The locket must stay buried." Miss Marple's breath caught. This was no botanical note, but a confession's shadow. She pocketed the page and hurried to Mr. Pork's shed, where he was cleaning lenses, his face drawn. "Miss Marple, you again," he said, his voice tight. "No more photos, I swear." She held up Pip's drawing, her gaze steady. "Pip saw someone that night, Mr. Pork. A figure in a light coat with a hairpin like Clara's. Did you see her in the garden?" Paulk's hands shook, his lens slipping. I was in my darkroom, like I said, but I heard Clara arguing with Elsie earlier, by the arbour. Something about Agnes, and a promise broken. Back in her parlour, Miss Marple spread her clues. The chemist's invoice, Clara's journal page, Pip's drawing, the locket, the riddle. Scatter me where the thorn pricks deepest. Felt closer now, its thorns pointing to Clara's greenhouse and Agnes's buried secrets. She wrote a note. Confront Clara about aconite. Verify Palk's alibi. Check Elsie's tonic bottle. The village was a tangle of lies, but the truth was blooming, sharp and inevitable. As the clock strikes 8 and the night cloaks St. Mary Mead, we leave Miss Marple with her clues, the greenhouse's shadow looming large. In Chapter 10, a final confrontation unveils the killer, and the rose petals riddle finds its bitter end. If you're enjoying this tale, hit subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Chapter 10. The Petal's Truth. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead bled into twilight, a bruised purple that mirrored the village's hidden wounds, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Gossington Hall one final time. The air was crisp with the scent of fading roses, their petals curling like clenched fists against the encroaching cold. In her pocket, the weight of the chemist's invoice, Clara's journal page with its damning scrawl. She knows too much. The locket must stay buried. And Pip's drawing pressed against her, each a petal in the riddle that had bloomed into this deadly garden. The sergeant had wired for Scotland Yard that afternoon, his plodding investigation yielding nothing but frustration. But Miss Marple knew better than to wait for outsiders. Truth, like tea, was best served hot, and tonight, under the lanterns of the rose garden, it would be poured out at last. Colonel Bantry met her at the door, his moustache drooping like a wilted bloom, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. "Jane, you've got that look, the one that says you've cracked it. The guests are gathering again, God help us, for some memorial supper Dolly insisted on. Clara's here, fussing over the flowers. Edward's brooding in the library. The Craddocks are whispering prayers. Even Polk's lurking with his camera, though I've half a mind to smash it." Miss Marple patted his arm, her voice steady as the church bells. "Gather them in the garden, Arthur, after the toasts. The roses will bear witness." He nodded, draining his glass, and she slipped inside, the hall's warmth doing little to thaw the chill in her bones. The supper unfolded in the dining room like a strange charade, candlelight flickering over silver and crystal, the table laden with cold meats, cheeses veined like secrets, and a centerpiece of crimson roses from the very beds where Elsie had fallen. Dolly fluttered about, her laughter forced, pressing slices of ham on Griselda, who picked at her plate with pale fingers. Reverend Leonard murmured grace, his words on forgiveness ringing hollow in the heavy air. Edward Symington sat at the head, his face a granite mask, though his eyes darted to the garden doors as if expecting a ghost. Dr. Haydock puffed his pipe silently, his gaze on Clara, who arranged the roses with meticulous care, her light coat draped over a chair, its fabric pale as moonlight. Mr. Polk hovered at the edges, his camera idle for once, his cheeks flushed with sherry or shame. Miss Marple observed it all from her seat, her fork tracing patterns in her untouched salad, her mind replaying the riddle etched on the petal. "Scatter me where the thorn pricks deepest, and roots of envy shall wither unseen." It wasn't whimsy, nor a madman's verse. It was Clara's confession, born of a love buried deep and an envy that festered like blight in the soil. As the plates cleared and Dolly raised a glass to Elsie's memory, "To a gentle soul taken too soon," Miss Marple felt the moment arrive, sharp as a thorn's prick. She rose, her chair scraping softly, and suggested they adjourn to the garden for air, the lanterns already lit like wary eyes in the dusk. The group spilled out onto the flagstones, the rosebeds a riot of colour under the strings of lights, their thorns casting jagged shadows that danced like accusations. Constable Higgins lingered at the edges, his notebook at the ready, while the sergeant, newly arrived from the village, puffed a cigarette and watched with sceptical eyes. Miss Marple positioned herself by the arbour, where Clara had first screamed, the very spot where footsteps had rustled in the laurels. "A beautiful night," she began, her voice carrying clear and calm, drawing all eyes. "Though beauty often hides thorns, like our riddle, found in Elsie's hand. Scatter me where the thorn pricks deepest, and roots of envy shall wither unseen. We've all puzzled over it, haven't we? But riddles, like gardens, reveal themselves when you tend the roots." Clara stiffened beside the rosebed, her fingers twisting a stem, a single petal loosening and drifting to the path. Edward shifted, his jaw tight. Griselda clutched Leonard's arm, Polk edged toward the shadows. Miss Marple continued, her gaze sweeping them like sunlight through leaves. Elsie wasn't killed for her will, though it stung Edward that she left her inheritance to the boys, bypassing him as Agnes once had with her own nest egg. Nor for the debts weighing on his practice, though those poison pen letters, yes, Edward, the ones you wrote to Agnes and later to Elsie, in that angular hand to drive them from your home, those were thorns of your own making. You burned the evidence, but ash leaves traces, and keys unlock more than drawers. Edward's face drained of colour, his voice a rasp. "Jane, this is madness. I loved Elsie in my way. The letters were regrets, not threats." But Miss Marple held up a hand, gentle but unyielding. "Regrets can poison as surely as aconite, Edward. But the blade that ended her, that was no regrets work. It was born of a deeper prick, the thorn of lost love, envy for one who dared unearth it." She turned to Clara, who had gone still as stone, the lantern light hollowing her cheeks. "Clara, my dear, you and Agnes shared more than plants and potions. That photograph from 49, your hand on her arm in the rose garden, the locket open with its hidden note. A love letter, wasn't it? Proof of your bond. The one that sustained her through Edward's cold grip. The one you guarded like a rare bloom." Clara's breath hitched, her eyes glistening, but she said nothing, her knuckles white on the rose stem. The group murmured, Dolly gasping softly, the sergeant straightening with sudden interest. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice a thread pulling the truth taut. "Agnes confided in you, Clara. Her father's miniature will in the locket's compartment, protecting her fortune from Edward's grasp, and tucked beside it, your words, your promise. When she fell ill, pneumonia or heartbreak, you scattered those petals at her grave, pink roses from her own garden, whispering vows to keep it buried. But Elsie, ever the devoted governess turned stepmother, found the locket in Edward's study. She puzzled it out, the provenance from the Bristol jeweller, the calls to Reginald Blake to verify and safeguard it. She confronted you in the greenhouse, didn't she? Asking about your remedies, your shared history, threatening to tell Dr. Haydock to free the boys from a home shadowed by secrets." Clara's facade cracked then, a tear tracing her cheek as the rose stem snapped in her hand, blood welling from a thorn's nick. "She wouldn't let it rest," she whispered, her voice breaking like dry twigs. "Elsie came to me that afternoon, waving the locket, saying she'd send it to London, expose it all, for the boys' sake, she claimed. But it was pity, Jane, pity for me, married to Haydock's indifference, clinging to a ghost. She said the truth would wither my roots, my life here. I begged her, please scatter it where it belonged, with Agnes. But she laughed, said secrets were like weeds." Bess pulled up. The group was frozen, breaths held, as Clara's words spilled like spilled ink. "I followed her to the garden that night, the supper's noise covering my steps, my light coat, my hairpin catching in the laurels. I meant only to take the locket back, but she turned, her eyes so sure, and the pruning knife was there, in my pocket from the greenhouse. One thrust, Jane, to silence the envy she'd stirred in me. For her youth, her place with the boys, her ignorance of thorns like ours." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft with sorrow, not judgment. "And the petal? Your riddle, inked on a crimson bloom from the Ena Harkness, slipped into her hand as she fell. Scatter me. your love's remnants, like ashes or petals at Agnes's grave. Where the thorn pricks deepest, the heart, where betrayal and loss converge, roots of envy shall wither unseen. Your hope that the truth would die with her, buried in the soil of St. Mary Mead. Clara sank to the flagstones, sobs racking her, the broken rose falling from her fingers. Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his face ashen, pipe forgotten. "Clara, why didn't you tell me?" But she only shook her head, whispering, "You wouldn't understand. No one does." The sergeant moved then, cuffs glinting as he took Clara's arm, murmuring rights while Higgins jotted furiously. Edward slumped against the arbour, confessing his letters in a broken rush. Born of jealousy over Agnes's independence, revived against Elsie for her prying. Polk admitted snapping the hidden photographs at Clara's request to preserve memories she'd never share. Griselda wept for the friends she'd envied. Leonard prayed aloud for mercy. Dolly embraced Miss Marple, tears soaking her shawl, while the colonel poured another round, his voice gruff with relief. "Jane, you've done it again. The village can breathe now." As the lanterns dimmed and the guests dispersed into the night, Miss Marple lingered by the rosebed, scattering a handful of petals, crimson and pink mingled. At the path's edge, the riddle was solved, its thorns plucked, but the garden of human hearts would bloom anew, with secrets as eternal as the seasons. St. Mary Mead would heal, petal by petal, under the watchful eye of its unassuming guardian. And there you have it. Dear viewers, the curtain falls on Miss Marple's Rose Petal Riddle, a tale where love's deepest roots twist into tragedy and truth blooms from the darkest soil. If this mystery kept you guessing, give it a thumbs up. Drop a comment below with your favourite twist, and subscribe for more stories that unravel like a cozy cup of tea on a rainy afternoon. Your support keeps these tales alive. Until next time, keep your gardens tended and your secrets, well, perhaps share a few. Good night.